In this video, I'm going to go through the 6 syllabus outcome for the Design and Technology Preliminary HSC. The outcome is P4.2, which is a student uses resources effectively and safely in the development and production of design solutions. If we look at this has students learn about, and we have these key dot points. So I'm going to read out first the dashes. Using materials, tools, techniques, and other resources, characteristics and properties, functions and use, experimentation, criteria for selection, and consequences of use. We have the dot point that students learn about the realization of ideas through the manipulation of materials, tools, techniques, and materials and other resources. And we learn about safety. Safety in the use of materials, tools, techniques, and we have legislative requirements, including work health and safety. Students learn to select appropriate materials, tools, techniques, and other resources. Students learn to justify and explain the selection of those resources. Students learn to develop and demonstrate proficiency in using appropriate range of materials, tools, techniques, and other resources. And students learn to implement safe work practices when designing and producing. Okay, so if we go to the chapter here, I've got that written there. Following from the Wesley textbook, we have the first section is the selection of appropriate resources, justifying and explaining the selection of those resources, developing and demonstrating proficiency using resources, and then we have finally safety and use of materials, tools, and workmanship. Now it's worth pointing out that we will be producing over the course of the year 2 minor projects, and before we do that, I'll do some non-assessed projects in class to help you before you start doing things that are going to be assessed. In year 12, you will all be doing a major project, and I urge you to start considering now how you'll apply the same skills that you're doing now in next year. So, to start off with, I say that resources include everything used in the process and of design and producing projects, whatever. This includes materials, so this is the stuff that we make things out of. This typically is going to be things like, for the physical world, our raw materials of wood or metal or paper. It could also be ingredients in the case of food, or it could be things like in the shaped environment. It could include garden materials or the physical space that we're going to use. It could also be for products. We could be using things like plastic or textiles. Okay, we also use physical or digital tools and equipment. So physical tools are the things that we typically think of as tools. This is saws, this is saws, hammers, sewing machines. Also digital tools and equipment. This is where we think about a digital tool might be Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop. Also things like cameras, scanners, 3D printers are all tools that we might use, laser cutters. Infrastructure, services, and storage. Now the idea I want to talk about here is that if you're building a website, you're going to need a ISP, an internet service provider. Without that, you don't. Even if you're going to host your own website, you're going to need hardware in order to have uptime, and you're still going to need an ISP, even if no one in this class is going to become their own ISP. So you're going to need other services. You're going to need other people who are going to support you with various things. You might need storage. That could be digital storage. That could be physical storage. You're going to need information sources. So when you're researching, you're going to seek out information, and that information is going to be a resource. That's something that's going to help you to produce your project. You're going to need people who will assist you. So HR in companies is human resources. They're the people who they help businesses to manage their staff. Staff are resources, but also you might have, so in this case, teachers are resources. Your friends and family might be resources. If you're going to develop, your project's going to be a movie, for instance, then you're going to need actors in your movie. You're going to need camera operators, film operators. You're going to need makeup people just to help you with set design, costume design. So they might be people who help you in the achieving your projects. Okay, so when we get to select those resources, good designers should efficiently select the resources that best help them to achieve their goals. Now, I say efficiently because time is a consideration and money is a consideration. You need to pick the resources that are going to be the best for you, keeping in mind a variety of different criteria. Here's some of the criteria that we should consider. We should consider cost. Now, the problem is with cost that most people tend to consider the initial cost only. they don't consider the cost during the production, and they don't consider the cost. So what I mean by that is that the initial cost might be lower for a material, but there's a lot more work involved. There might be higher transport costs. There might be more setup costs because it's a lower quality. There might be more work that needs to be done in order to achieve that. You might have to drive further to pick it up. There are also the lifetime costs. So this is that it might be that material might be harder to dispose of. That might be harder for the client, the end user, to use, to maintain, or to dispose of. The next thing might be availability and reliability. So there's a joke that can be summed up as, when we're out of stock, our product is half price. I won't go into that joke now. I'll tell you about that in just regular class time. But the idea that availability, it doesn't matter if a product is cheap if you can't buy it. So that is really important. Reliability as well. It doesn't matter if a product is cheap if they don't show up. It doesn't matter if, let's say we're talking about a concreter. So I want to build houses. A concreter can be really cheap, but it doesn't matter if they don't show up on time. If I'm sitting there with a concrete truck and I don't have anyone to actually to work the concrete, then that's not good, because I only need to get burnt once or twice for that to be totally blow out all the cost of the saving that I would get otherwise. So availability and reliability are important. Equipment and expertise needed. So we might have a really, really powerful tool. I might have let's say Final Cut is a very good editing program, but it might be, although it's expensive and I have it available, I might not have a machine that can actually run Final Cut. Or I might find that I actually don't have the expertise to use Final Cut Pro because it's a tool that I haven't used before. So I'd be better off using the tool that will run well on my machine and that I'm competent and familiar in how to use, rather than arguably a piece of equipment, a better resource that I don't have the equipment or expertise to operate. Appearance and aesthetics, the user experience. So obviously we might have fabrics that feel nicer, that look nicer. We might have materials that have cultural value. So for instance, walnut is generally considered to be, in our culture, it might have functional characteristics, but just the appearance of walnut tends to be makes that product a more satisfying a satisfying material aesthetically. We also have things like user experience. So for instance, a website might even be functionally quite good to use, but if people feel frustrated by the experience, which I know is a bit paradoxical that it could be functionally very good, but users don't like it, then that could be an example of a negative aesthetic in a non-visual or tactile way. Functional criteria are the ones that we typically think of. We think about things like strength. Is it strong enough to do the job? Is it durable? Will it last well in the sun? Workability is the ability to be manufactured into worked or produced into the shapes that we need. Bandwidth, I'm using that as an example for things like digital technologies. We need to make sure that the product we're using is fast enough or can deal with the, say for a website, the amount of traffic that we're going to have. The features of a product. So if I'm buying a new camera, or if I'm getting a new piece of software, there might be features that are just simply essential that will drastically improve my workflow and make it much faster. And if I have to use another computer that doesn't have, or another piece of software that doesn't have those features, or another device that doesn't have those features, that might be frustrating. For example, our laser cutter that we have at school is a relatively small laser cutter. It's better than no laser cutter at all, and it might even be a very high quality laser cutter for the things it can do. But comparatively, I might say that I'd be willing to give up some features in order just to have a bigger cutting table so that I can work on larger projects. Or when I'm doing class projects, I can reduce my setup time. We also need to consider things like sustainability. So a big consideration these days is energy consumption, not just because of the cost of energy consumption, but for the ethics of environmental the depletion of non-renewable resources, but also things like carbon dioxide. So renewability is important, whether or not something is, whether or not we're using resources that will no longer be available for future generations, and the effect of disposal. So for instance, one of the big reasons against the use of nuclear power is that we have to dispose of nuclear waste. Legality and ethics. So as I mentioned in the previous video, sometimes the important criteria for evaluation is simply that you must use this in order to not be breaking the law. And as an ethical designer, we probably want to, and a designer who complies with laws, we need to use these materials or that process just as a bare minimum. We consider things like safety, probity, and working conditions. So when selecting materials, probity means that we have gone through the appropriate channels to avoid corruption. A simple example for this would be that if I am a government organization, I'm deciding who I'm going to buy the paper from, the entire state is going to buy their paper from. Now, when I make that decision, this is a decision's worth, let's say, $1 million, and one of the 3 people that I could buy paper from is my brother, and my brother says, I'll tell you what, look, I know it's $1 million. If you charge $1.1 million, we can split the extra 1.1 between us and get $50,000 each. That would be an example of not meeting probity requirements. Another example would be that if I need to hire a new staff member, that hiring my niece rather than someone who's more qualified for the job would be an example of me not choosing the material that will best help me to achieve my design goals. Maybe you're in a situation where you can choose to select to choose your niece over other people because you're not accountable to other people, but often, especially when you're working in a government position, we have probity requirements. Worker conditions are another thing to consider. If I'm buying clothing, I might want to consider whether or not my clothes have been made meeting the standards of workplace standards that I would expect that I would want for myself. So that means that fair working hours and people are able to take leave, they're able to use the bathroom, that they're getting paid a fair wage. These are the working conditions that I might want to consider. Skills, knowledge, and suitability for people. So if I'm choosing a employee as one of my resources, I might want to choose someone based on the skills that they have, the knowledge that they have of the industry, and how suitable they are to my team, whether or not they meet my workplace culture, whether or not they're going to show up on time, whether or not they're going to meet their commitments, how reliable they are. We talked about reliability earlier. If we're using information as a resource, we have to consider accuracy. Is the information correct? How reliable is it? Also, we have to consider credibility. So credibility is whether or not we could trust the person who's providing this resource. Is this coming from a government organization that has good credentials? It's a trusted organization. Or is this coming from a website that we really don't know who's providing the information? We don't have any way of knowing whether or not what sort of accountability they have or what sort of peer review that they've undergone. Okay, moving on to the next topic, we have justifying and explaining the selection of use of resources. In your folio, you're going to have to explain why you've used every choice you make. So your design followers will need to document why you have chosen the resources you select for your projects. You should be able to support your decision with reference to your testing, research, or expert supporting information. How are you going to support the materials and resources that you've used? Well, you might say, I've tested the process. So we talked about the broomsticks, the Quidditch broomsticks project. So that student, she tested the processes that she was going to use. She tested 3 or 4 processes and said, this one is the process that is the most effective for me, before she started her production of her actual final product. Research might be, rather than doing first-hand research, it might be secondary research, where we've discussed earlier that you might select your product. You might decide the video editing software that you're going to use based on the recommendations of a trusted review on the internet. It could be from a YouTube video, it could be from a peer-reviewed journal. Or expert supporting information. So information that has come from, so we've talked about research, expert supporting information. So I spoke to this expert in the field and this expert in the field, I called them up, I did an interview, I spoke to a teacher, I spoke to a specialist, and they told me, or I spoke to, say, survey information. So the survey information said that they preferred red materials to blue materials. So for when I make my textiles project, that I chose to use a red cloth because that was going to be more popular for my team jersey. Developing and demonstrating proficiency in using resources. Your design projects will demonstrate that you can use a range of skills, processes, or techniques to produce a quality project. So like I said, we're going to do 2 minor projects, 2 assessable projects in year 11, and a major project in year 12. For all of these, you will need to demonstrate a range of skills, processes, or techniques. You'll need to provide evidence that you have used resources safely, proficiently, ethically, and efficiently. So, safety means that you didn't injure, you weren't at risk of injuring anybody. Proficiently means that you could do it at a reasonable quality. Ethically means that you took into account whether or not what you were doing was harming others. And efficiently means that you did it in a timely way without spending unnecessary time or effort or cost. These skills that you might develop might include things like sketching, researching, timber or metalworking, so physical skills, digital multimedia skills, textiles production skills, electronics or industrial processes, so for instance using a laser cutter, using a 3D printer, or using Arduinos, or programming software, organizational skills. Work that is influenced by others must respect the original designer's intellectual property. Now, we're going to talk about intellectual property at great length in further chapters, but the idea is that when people produce a work, they have certain rights to that work. Anything that is produced that demonstrates creativity, so this includes songs, pictures, writing, are all protected by a concept called copyright. So anyone who makes something, by the moment they produce it, they have a protection of that work. If someone goes and copies that work without changing it significantly, you can take action to see that work is either that they either stop selling that work, stop publishing that work, they no longer make it available on the internet, take down the video from the internet, or that you could actually sue for damages for the loss of income that they've incurred because of your infringement on intellectual property. Other products can be protected by a patent. So this is processes and products can be protected by a patent. This is a legal action that is taken where people protect their work by saying that I have developed this technique, this process, this product, and no one else is allowed to produce a product using a similar technique without paying me some sort of royalty. The third one is a trademark. So a trademark might be that, for instance, pink bats in Australia, there's insulating bats that are called pink bats. Only one company is allowed to call their insulation pink bats, and only one company is allowed to color their insulation pink, because that's a part of what they've used to differentiate, to show their level of quality. There are other good examples. A recent case that came up in the last month or so at the time of my recording of this is the term Big Mac. And so if I started a restaurant and started calling my burgers Big Mac, McDonald's might have a reasonable case to come and say that I can't call my burger Big Mac. But they recently lost a very important case in the European Union, and because of the use of Supermac, they lost it to Supermac, and there's been a bit of fallout from that. But that's something we'll talk more about in class time. Safety and the use of materials, tools, and workmanship. Okay, so this is where we're talking about legislation and the way that we prevent accidents. So accidents is an interesting term. There's a lot of government organizations, for instance, roadside crash investigators, they don't use the term accident. They say that there's always a person who was at fault, and the accident indicates that it was not caused by an individual. I would say an accident is something that's not intended, and if someone is intentionally trying to cause someone harm, I would argue that that's not an accident. We wouldn't confuse that between a safety problem and an act of violence. So what we're going to go here is that, so I will use the word accident. I just want to make the point here, but what I've tried to do is avoid that word in my text. All workplaces must comply with the Work Health and Safety Act of 2011. It sets legal responsibilities and duties intended to promote health and safety. So the law in Australia is that all workplaces, including schools, which are workplaces, must meet the WHS Act of 2011. Everyone in workplaces has rights and responsibilities under the WHS Act. So the thing I say to students in year 7 when we do our safety test at the start is that everyone has a responsibility for safety, which means that if you see something that is unsafe and you know about it and you don't act on it, your responsibility is just to tell the person in charge, which is usually the teacher. But if I, as a teacher, see something that I know is unsafe and I don't report or act to prevent that thing that is unsafe, then I could be held legally accountable for any injury that might occur. Work cover is the statutory authority. So the textbook defines statutory authority as a organization created through an act to carry out that act. I think something along those lines. It's not a question I will test you on, but it's worth noting that it is mentioned in the let me find it. Statutory authority is there. Okay. That enforces work cover is the statutory authority that enforces the WHS Act in New South Wales. So in New South Wales, the body with legal authority over workplace safety is work cover. Work cover and other professional bodies publish codes of practice that set out expectations of safety and ethics for various fields and professions. So if you're a concreter, if you're an electrician, there was a code of practice for both of those fields, and that they set out these expectations of how you should behave and how you should conduct your work in order to do so safely. Now, they're not. Sometimes they're legally binding, but I think generally codes are published. It definitely can be used as evidence in a court to demonstrate that you're not meeting the standards of your peers, and that is often the legal standard. In some cases, regulatory bodies or codes of practice for things like advertising are really just guidelines and not enforceable. They're established by the peers, so they're not necessarily a legal requirement. Now, I think Engineers Australia, so for instance, the regulatory authority there is Engineers Australia, and Engineers Australia I don't think has a lot of legal authority, but because it's established by engineers for engineers, if an engineer doesn't follow the guidelines set out by Engineers Australia, they can be sued as not meeting the standards of their peers. So that's an example of codes of practice in terms of safety and ethics. Everyone in workplaces should be properly trained for the work and conditions they are likely to encounter. So that means that if I have Year 7 students coming in to work in a workshop, I have to train them for the tools and the environment that they're going to be working in. Now, if our school had a different set of situations to others, I need to take into account, let's say for instance we had a lot of snakes in our school. It would be reasonable for me to prepare students and to train them to how to deal with snakes so that they don't go and try to pick up the snakes. The idea is that workplaces are supposed to take into account their specific circumstances and train their staff and anyone who might be going onto the site. So that could be people who come on the site regularly, like students, or people who come as visitors, that they're aware of the risks that they're likely to encounter. Okay, a procedure involved in reducing the likelihood of severity of workplace injury is to carry out a risk assessment. Every time we go on an excursion, I have to fill out a risk assessment. This is a big enough deterrent that I very rarely go on excursions. When we go on excursions, we have to carry out a risk assessment for everything that we're any hazard that we might be likely to occur. So the typical ones I write for a risk assessment is we have to cross the road. So there's a risk that you might be struck by a vehicle while walking to or from the venue. You have to take public transport typically. So I have to worry about a student may become lost, or we may be involved in a vehicle collision. So what I have to think about is, they might get lost. Students might have to use a certain equipment. They might have to use dangerous equipment. They might have to use scissors, for instance. And so for each of these risks that I identify, I have to apply a control measure. Now, for some of these, I can eliminate the hazard. So I'll go through each of these with a little bit of detail, but this I don't think is covered in the textbook. The hierarchy of controls is 5 steps that we use to minimize risks. So what it does is reduces the likelihood and the severity of the risks. Now, the reason why it's a hierarchy is the ones at the top are more important and more useful than the ones on the bottom. The first thing is eliminating the hazard. If we can eliminate the hazard altogether, we don't need to worry. So the best example I can think of is working at heights. So when they built the London Eye, which is the giant Ferris wheel in the middle of London, right on the Thames, rather than working at heights, the entire wheel, the Ferris wheel, was built on the ground and then lifted into place. By doing so, they just eliminated the heights from the equation altogether. That was an elimination of that hazard. Substitution of a hazard is where we exchange a more dangerous hazard for a less dangerous hazard. So an example that people often use is replacing electric power tools with pneumatic power tools. So if an electric power tool needs to be plugged in, we need to run power cables. Often we work in construction, we will work in the wet environments, and the power tools could cause someone to be electrocuted. If we, on the other hand, use compressed air, it still has an inherent danger that people might, a compressed air nail gun can still cause serious harm, but we've eliminated the electrocution risk. Therefore, we've substituted the risk for a lesser risk. We can use engineering controls. Typically, that's the term we use, engineering controls, but I've written here to fit the sentence structure. We've said physically isolate hazards. So the idea there is if we put up a physical barrier, if we're worried about kids running across the road, to prevent that, what we can do is we can create a physical barrier. Now, physical barriers are less good than just eliminating the risk altogether. But by having a physical barrier, I mean, people could still climb over the barrier, but it would take a very dedicated person to overcome a physical isolation. So that they're still somewhat effective, but they're not as effective as just removing the risk altogether. The next one is to have rules, which we call administrative controls, or I've said here, just to follow the sentence structure, apply systems to avoid hazards. So a system is, I'm going to add in the word administrative. Apply administrative systems. This is rules. So this is the idea that when I have students walk to and from an excursion, that I might have buddies so that the student's less likely to get lost, that students are going to wait at the traffic lights before they cross the road. I might take the students' mobile phone numbers so I can call them in event that they get lost. They would all be administrative systems that I've applied to prevent or to minimize the severity and likelihood of an occurrence. The last one is PPE. I'll write that in here. PPE is, I'll put it in brackets here, engineering controls. PPE, personal protective equipment, is when we wear safety goggles, gloves, hearing protection. These are not ideal, but often the risk can't be prevented, the risk can't be substituted. We have to use this equipment. And in the case that we're going to use this equipment, we can at least try to prevent the severity and likelihood of an injury by using equipment to protect us. So, I mean, if we use the example of baking a cake and taking a cake out of the oven, well, we could try to find a way of making a cake without an oven, but it's probably not going to be a great cake. We could substitute the cake for something else. We could choose, but we decide that we definitely want to make a cake. We want to physically isolate people from the kitchen, that's fine, but someone is going to have to go in and get the oven out of there, unless we're going to use some sort of robotic system. We're going to have rules. We're going to say to the kids in the house, don't go near the oven while we're cooking. Now, it's less good than having a physical barrier to keep people out of the kitchen, having a locked door, for instance, but it's a system that we can use, and often that will be good enough. That will work for reasonable people of reasonable intelligence. But finally, we have to get the cake out of the oven. We can't touch the cake directly with our the cake pan with our hand, so we use an oven mitt. That would be the example of us applying the hierarchy of controls to minimize the severity and likelihood of an injury while taking a cake out of the oven. Now, it's important to say that even projects that are entirely digital must still demonstrate the health and safety considerations when working, the considerations of working in an office environment. So what it means is that even if you're doing a website design for your major project, you're still going to have to say in your folio that you show to the HSC markers that you've considered the health and safety effects of working in an office. So this might be the simple ones that we typically talk about ergonomics and repeated stress injury. And it's ironic that I record this video while I was sitting with very bad posture in my bed while working on a laptop, which I'm aware is bad for me, but I've still done that. But you will have to demonstrate you provide evidence in your folio to say that you sat upright and you considered the height of your laptop and that you used good posture to avoid having injury as a result of your work. Okay, lastly, we're going to have the review questions to assess your knowledge. So we're going to identify the five types of resources. I've listed those. I'm not going to scroll too much, but 5 types of resources. I've got 5 there. That looks like you could use those. You just have to list them because it's only identify. We're going to describe 3 criteria that could be used in consideration of resources. I've talked about a great many of those, right? Cost, availability, etc. I've got at least 5 there. Describe 3 ways that you can justify your selection of resources. This is described, so this means you need to write a full sentence for each one of these. You need to talk about testing, experimentation, or expert consideration. This could be that could include your own personal experience. Analyze what it means. So rather than testing something you tested, might say, I've used this in the past and found it to be suitable. That might be an expert source. Analyze what it means to use resources safely, proficiently, ethically, and efficiently. Now, analyze is a more complicated. This is the highest order HSC verb, and critically analyze would mean write a full essay, but analyze means we will need to write a paragraph. So what that means is we need to talk about how these things are related, how they interact with each other, and draw out the implications of those things. So we need to talk about when we're using resources, this is just using any resource generally, we need to use our resources safely, we need to use them proficiently or to get a quality outcome, we need to use them ethically, and we need to use them efficiently. So efficiently, we talked about being time, money, producing the good outcome. So that should be at least a paragraph where we identify, I would suggest, each of those 4 things, and we describe how they relate with each other and what the outcome of their interaction is, how they come together. Okay, identify the legislation that specifies responsibilities related to workplace and safety. Well, it's called the Work, Health and Something Act. It's important to include the year because prior to that there used to be a different act, which was the OH&S Act of 2001. Describe the hierarchy of which was only New South Wales. The new act is national for Australian students. Describe the hierarchy of hazard control methods. I've used a little bit more of a clunky term. I think if you looked it up on Wikipedia, they'd call it the hierarchy of controls. Like I said, there's 5. Because I've said describe, you need to use a full sentence for each. Identify 2 examples of potential hazards used in an office environment. Well, I've just mentioned one. I've mentioned ergonomics. I could talk about light and how you might use some, like say, software like this here, which is Flux. For those of you watching the video, Flux to ensure that I don't get eye strain and that I go to sleep well rested. But there's other aspects of, say, I need to ensure I have a safe work environment, so that if I have electrical cables, that they're safely out of the way, that if I'm reaching for high objects, that I don't stand on a chair. There's a whole bunch of different things, but if you look at the past folios from students that I've provided to you, you'll be able to look at those and get a number of examples, at least 2, which you only have to identify. You don't have to write them out. You just need to give me a list of them. Okay, so that's chapter 6, and that is it that will be it for what we do in our test.